usually I think discussion is very productive. So I'll save time for discussion. Okay, I will share the screen. So the COVID-19 pandemic has achieved what countless humans have failed to, countless activists have failed to do over the past 50 years since Earth Day was first celebrated on April 22nd, 1970. Factories were shut, flights were canceled, people stayed home, tended gardens, and went hiking when possible. Many of us came to the same conclusion: it is okay for us humans to do less. So I'm showing images of a work from 2 years ago in Thailand. So this is an installation in a national park. So I'll start again. It says, life is hard. Why do we make it so easy? So when I made this 2 years ago, I was thinking about the ecological crisis, but I think the work actually didn't resonate with a lot of people. It is only actually when the pandemic hit, people started to notice that these images and then the slogan, and I think it's quite particularly poignant in this year. The slogan came from a TED Talk in Thailand. The original TED Talk was, life is easy. Why do we make it so hard? It's an activist farmer who was talking about the farming life in Thailand. People could stay as farmers, have a good, relatively easy life. So why do people choose to go to cities and become migrant workers? So that's the original statement. Life is easy. Why do we make it so hard? And I flipped the sentence. I'm not really saying no to the original speaker. I'm mainly to point out there's another dimension of life, which is more than human life, because the original statement was more about human life in human society. So I wanted to flip it to think about life in the more than human sense. So we have made our lives very easy over the last 200 years. And of course, this year is harder for us, but it's really mainly caused by this backlash. I see it more like an ecological rebalancing. So among the lessons that the virus has taught us is that we cannot keep living in the say that we own this planet. We do not. We account for only 0.01% of the total biomass on Earth. We have to collaborate with other species, whether we like it or not. This includes addressing the climate crisis and the global ecological meltdown. This also requires us to find a new definition for art. So this is a work I did in Hong Kong. Again, it's a slogan using living plants. So you are the 0.01% refers to our percentage as the total biomass on Earth. But I'm also linking it to the we are the 99% slogan made popular by the Occupy Wall Street movement. So I wanted to point out the connection between human inequality within human society, and the inequality in the biosphere. So of course, many of us belong to the 99% in the human realm. But if we take a step back and look at the biosphere, then we are part of the 0.01%. So how do we think about these inequalities, and how do we address both of these inequalities? Okay. So I started working with plants 8 years ago. When people ask me how I decided to migrate from socially engaged practice to ecological practice, my honest answer is I actually didn't decide it, because I was actually attracted by this patch of weeds in Shanghai. So it was not really my decision, I was tempted. So this is a patch of weeds in central Shanghai. If you go to Shanghai now, this is now the central art area called the West Bund. Many museums are now here. I'm sure if you go to Shanghai, you will go to this area. But when I went there in the summer of 2013, I saw this patch of weeds in the middle of the city. They were just so lush and vibrant, and I was shocked to find this habitat in the center of the city, and talked to the curator and said whether I could claim this as part of my art projects in order to keep the habitat for at least a few years. So we went in and identified the weeds in this patch of, in this piece of land. And then we also created an online course with local scholars to discuss the relationship between plants and urban history, literature in Shanghai, as well as Chinese medicine, architecture, urban design, etc. So I was interested in the online, the MOOC movement. I was thinking, how can we make this not a global situation, but actually related to a local situation? But I very much appreciated the collaborative work in the MOOC, where we can share something online and many people can access for free. So these are friends and who also teach in Shanghai in different disciplines. So we had an online course, and then every Sunday we will have on-site activities. So people can watch the lecture online and then come to the site. So this is how I actually started to work with plants. I was more interested in urban situations at the time, but I gradually moved to thinking about plants in their own terms. I'll talk about this a bit later. Okay. So since I started working with plants, this issue whether I should take the credit for the projects I do, of course not, because things change after, if I'm working with living beings in particular, things grow and change. And so I only can take half of the credit at most. So this is another work in Shanghai. This is another work in China. It's a contemporary art museum built in Nanjing. The triangle is a work I did with the local landscape team. We transplanted weeds from surrounding areas to the roof of this museum. I won't go into the detail, but just to say one thing, I knew that the work will change, but I didn't fully anticipate how the work will change. After a few, I don't have a picture here, but after a few years after I went back, of course, the weeds started to move around, right? They don't stay in the shape, sort of this abstract art shape. They move. And then after a few years, the shape really is now more corresponding to the light and shadow of the building. So when there's light, the weeds grow very well. When there's shadow, they don't grow so well. So the original sort of abstract art is now moving more into an ecological situation where they really respond to the light and shadow. So I often talk about this work where I couldn't, I mean, I could have known if I had more ecological sense, but I certainly didn't know when I started the work, and I was happy to see how the work has changed, not by my own intention. So this is another work in another museum in China, working with local farmers to bring weeds to the museum to set up a little garden. Okay. So this is a work about socialism good. So this is a slogan. When I grew up in the 70s and 80s in China, so when I grew up, this slogan was still very much in our life, socialism good. But of course, when we were thinking about socialism, we were not thinking about more than human socialism. So I replanted this and left the plants to decide what to do. And after 2 weeks, weeds started to pop up. So you can see weeds in the patch. So it's, I think in a way, it kind of reminds us, if we let plants to decide the destiny of this slogan, how do they, what political idealism they might choose. I'm actually returning to this now in my dialogues with scientists in Berlin, but I'm more in sort of the biological, based on more on biological research. This work, when I did it 4 years ago in 2016, is still more on the visual level. Okay. So I started to, I also started to work with ferns in Taiwan. This is in 2016 again. I was in Taiwan and a botanist took me to a forest on the edge of the capital city, Taipei, where scientists like him gather ferns. Since then, I have been going to this forest every year, except this year because I couldn't, I'm not allowed to enter Taiwan because of the pandemic. So since 2016, I've been going there every year to make one short ecosexual film. I look forward to this annual ritual because the air in the forest is so invigorating. As artists, we usually wake up late, but in order to make this film, we have to get there very early in the morning to catch the sunlight. And we go there half awake, but because the forest is full of oxygen and phytoncides, our bodies and minds really reach a heightened level of agility and attentiveness in the forest. Plants reveal to us the full potential of the three-dimensional space. So mainly in this picture, you can see how densely three-dimensional the forest is. Massive bird's nest ferns perch on trees, tiny moss blanket rocks. The light is dramatic, the sound rich, and the aroma intense. The assemblage has a distinct style, yet is constantly changing. This forest is better than any artwork I have ever made, and better than any exhibition that I have seen. This series of ecosexual films, Teratophilia, it means in love of ferns, portray intimate encounters between local ferns and local men. I really do not know how I came up with this idea. I remember it was difficult to explain it to others until the first episode, this is the first episode, was made. So it's an introduction, and then part 2 shows this guy having sex with a giant bird's nest fern, and then he starts eating it. There's eating in it because this is an edible plant. If you go to Taiwan, make sure you actually try this plant in a restaurant because it's very delicious. So you can always ask for bird's nest fern, you can eat it like him. Okay, I mean, it's up to you whether you want to have sex with the plant before you eat it. So part 3 was with 3 SM performers, and I wanted to expand my understanding of sexuality and also to think about the potential of working with plants in sexual performance. So these are people who actually enjoy SM sex, and they work with me to really think about how to really play with plants. So we also talk about the pleasure from the plant's perspective, what's possible for them and what's possible for us. And last part was shot last year, and mainly about the young leaves, the fronds, because as humans, we have been fascinated by these patterns. You probably know the violins are designed inspired by this pattern. But of course, there are many sort of almost alien-like shapes that if you look into. So it's two young performers working with young leaves of the ferns. So this is an ongoing project. I haven't finished it. I actually need to. I mean, I should have made one this year, but I'll try to do it early next year. Okay. So this series of ecosexual films portray intimate encounters between local plants and local men. And then last year, I saw this YouTube video filmed in New South Wales, Australia, by ecologist Colin Bauer showing a wasp, the wasp there. In the common name is orchid dupe wasp. This wasp was passionately having sex with the orchid. You can see this on YouTube because of the internet. You know, I'm not screening. You can easily find this on YouTube. So it's an animal species having sex with a plant species. So when I saw this, when I saw this on YouTube, I thought, oh wow, this is just like my film, or maybe more accurately, my film is just like this in nature. So in both instances, an animal and a plant are entangled in interspecies sexual performance. The most imaginative idea of my artistic career has been proven to be nothing original. So I'm basically copying this. I was simply following orchids and wasps. We stand not on shoulders of giants, but in billions of years of evolution. So since then, I have incorporated this into the exhibition in Yokohama, where you can see one side is my film and the other side is the scientific footage. This is called pseudo-copulation for people who are interested. So two films are screened in the same space. And then there's a small print on the wall, maybe you can see. So this is a print by Japanese artist Hokusai. In the early 19th century, showing two octopuses having sex with a woman. So many people may have seen this print in art history books. I simply incorporate this in the exhibition to point out, you know, earlier artists already thought about interspecies sex. Of course, they were using print. There's no film media at the time. So I was happy to kind of folding these different threads into the exhibition to point out, you know, what I'm doing is actually not that original. So this is a workshop I did last year in Venice as a part of the public program, inviting people to try it. So we have plants with the audience, half plants, half audience in the theater. So I'll just briefly talk about another project I did last year. This is not on my website yet. So I was invited to do a residency in Japan, in Kyoto. And so I was taken to different areas in Kyoto. And then one particular area made me realize something. And then I decided to work in this neighborhood. So this area is called Sujin in Kyoto, and it's I'll show you some historical information and then talk about it. So this is an area where it's kind of like the untouchables in the Indian caste system. In Japanese, it's called Bulakumin. So it's people who are considered filthy in society. So these are people who work with animals like butchers, or people who work with plants like gardeners. So they work with other species, and then they were considered filthy, and then they were cast on the edge of the society and being shuffled around. So this particular neighborhood in Kyoto is called Sujin, and If you go there, if you walk from the Kyoto train station to this neighborhood, first you pass through very crowded areas. As soon as you step into the neighborhood, all of a sudden it becomes quiet, right? Because people don't want to go there still. So the stigma is still very much present in today's society in Japan. So I'm showing these historical photographs where the neighborhood people got together to build a primary school, and they have to do their own education, set up their own schools, and they tend to help, it becomes sort of a cooperative community. So these are countless people who have graduated from the primary school over the years. And they also introduced farming and physical education into the primary school. And then in 1922, a very important manifesto was started in this neighborhood. So this is a manifesto to call for human equality, kind of like the rights bill in the United States. So they were saying, as a society, we really need to think about all the humans as equals. So this is a historical movement. It's known by every Japanese student in high school. And then there was public housing, and it was run down, and I show you. So it's also interesting, the neighborhood is right next to the Kamo River, the main river in the city that flows through the city. With river, of course, there are always birds around. And also there's giant salamander in the mountain area. If the ecological condition is right, the giant salamander actually swims down the river. So, and now because the population is going down, like I'm showing contemporary photographs, the human population has gone down from 10,000 to 1,000. And then weeds started to grow. And the city wants to revitalize this area. And so these things really made me think about how do we think about this history of this area and also the future of this area. This is the document I talk about, calling for human equality. So I started a workshop. I organized a workshop with local young artists and also a local community organizer. So we spent 3 days trying different physical exercises. We learn from each other because everybody knows something that the other people don't know. So each person teaches the rest something. And then we also go hiking. We look at different animals and plants. So after 3 days, we updated the manifesto. So we created 2 new manifestos to think about the ecological equality in this area in the future, right? So how do we see the human population decline, not as a negative situation, but actually as an opportunity to think about multi-species relations? How do we work with the river? How do we work with the tradition of people working with animals and plants? So this is a small gesture to bring in these ideas into the neighborhood, which still carries the stigma, like I said earlier. The reason I work with local young artists was because I knew I would leave after a year, and I really need to convince them to do something. So because they live there, they actually work there. So what they can do can really affect the neighborhood in the long run. Okay. So these are the 2 manifestos we created last year. So this year, because the pandemic, I was finally spending most of my time in Hong Kong until I came to Berlin. So I started to go up the hill where I live to make a drawing every day. Because the previous few years I've been traveling to work in different cities and countries. And finally I'm home and where I can spend time with the plants around me to make myself more familiar. So every day I go up the hill to do a drawing. And since I came to Berlin, I also have been drawing every day one plant around me. I mean, one or a few plants around me. So these are the drawings from Hong Kong. For me, it's really not about, drawing these drawings as objects is really more about spending time with plants, because if I I started taking pictures, but then I realized, taking pictures is just, a few milliseconds. If I spend time there to draw, at least I spend an hour with the plants. And since I came to Berlin, I've been talking to scientists to learn from their research and really ask them to help me to think about how plants practice politics. The projects I worked on since 2013 until this year have been mainly thinking about how plants are entangled in human history, in our political history, in our colonial history, etc. Now I'm thinking about how plants actually practice politics on their own. So how do we imagine or perceive their political practice? Not so much entangled in human situations, but in their own ways. I can talk about this if there are questions. I can get into more detail on this. So I'll just say a little bit, and then we can have a discussion. Okay. So I mentioned that the work I did in Taiwan was a copy of Nature, but being outrun by flowers and wasps does not mean that we should just give up and do nothing. I learned recently from reading philosophers Roger Ames and David Hall that the Taoist term Wu Wei, I'm reading Taoist text this year, Dao De Jing in particular. The term Wu Wei should not be translated as no action or non-action, but non-coercive action that is in accordance with the principles of all things. Conservation scientists have also shown that human participation, when practiced wisely, can actually contribute to biodiversity. A 2019 study concludes that areas managed by indigenous communities in Australia, Brazil, and Canada have similar levels of vertebrate biodiversity to that of nature reserves. And I'm sure many people know Native Americans, when they managed the forests historically, they were actually able to contribute to biodiversity of the forests that they live in. So it really depends on whether we work with other beings in the planetary garden or exploit them until we all drop dead. It is time that we define art, not as human-only creation, but the vibrancy of 10,000 things. So 10,000 things is a Taoist term, Wan Wu. It's a literal translation, but people can also translate it as myriad beings. Okay. So I'll stop here. I mean, I have more works, of course, but we can probably get into discussion, and if something comes up, and then I'll share more images. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bo, for this quick insight into your work. I'll ask first into the round if there are any questions before I ask questions.
I have a question. I was wondering if you can give us more insights on the practices, or I believe you've developed like a set of practices through which one prepares themselves for these plant encounters, like how we make space for these.
So I'll try to. I mean, I'll try to respond. I mean, if it's not clear, just just let me know. I actually have been pretty reactive. So I often get invited to do a residency. That has been the mode of practice for the last few years, at least, in Shanghai, in Taiwan, in Kyoto, now in Berlin. So I get to the place, I walk around, I of course, I also talk to people. I read whatever I can find, but I mainly just walk around. Even now, when I talk to people, let's say if I want to talk to a scientist in Berlin, I usually ask them to go on a walk with me. So we don't sit down. I mean, like, now we're sitting down, I'm sitting on my floor. Actually, this is more comfortable for me. But usually I like walking as we talk. So, if I have better internet, maybe, there's better lighting, I would just go outside and do this. Because I want to get to know the city. I want to be able to talk to someone not as a sort of abstract human being, but more like a sort of a Homo sapiens embedded, at least in the urban ecology. And then something happens in my mind, and then I try to pull people also into my projects. I try to see what plants are around, the geological situation, and then I now talk about how projects grow, right? So I don't say, something is created. Projects actually grow. It's really like, of course, I bring something here, but it's also very much depend on the condition of the place where I happen to be in. So these sort of in Chinese we say the 天时地利人和, right? So the time of the heaven, the advantage of the land, and then the harmony of the people. So so these situations, I respond to it, and something will grow. And I think now when I also teach, so I often say to students that you have to trust something will grow, because we live on Earth and something will grow if we just water things, if we just nourish things, something will grow, and we have to let things grow rather than we try to. I was talking to my partner. I did something in Paris, a residency in Paris, and that didn't work very well. And then now I realized the main reason was I tried to control it. I tried to shape everything before I go. So now if I learn to respond and to the situation. And then I often say this, just another point, I often say my projects are quite messy. So you see, I do drawing, I do workshop, I do film, sometimes it's a slogan, it's installation. So first I thought I felt very uncomfortable because, many artists are much more consistent. They have sort of a good series of works, and I tend to have these different projects entangle, and then they happen at the same time. And then after a few years, I realized, maybe this is more ecological, right? So this, it's really like I'm cultivating a garden. There are these different projects, and sometimes I water something. This project grows a little bit this year. This project grows a little bit next year when different conditions are right. So it's really this messy, but it's more lively perhaps as a long-term practice. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I would have Juan, please, and then Julia.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Bo. It's very inspiring and really beautiful, reconciling, especially in these moments when we detach from any outside to see your work. But yeah, I'm very intrigued about the performances with nature, where these bodies are interacting with other bodies, natural bodies, in something that you call sex. And I'm still, I would like, maybe you can elaborate a bit more, because I kind of understand the word sex in the context you are placing it as more from the Western perspective, as an Anthropocene perspective. And I would like to explain that. Because I see the bodies of the humans are kind of having self-stimulation with the plants, but I don't see, and maybe something that you are speculating and researching about, what is the response of the plants, and if there is kind of a stimuli that during this, because it's not clear an intercourse that we attribute like the word sex in the Western perspective, let's say, to it's a stimula and an exchange of somatic aspects between these two entities, human and non-human, and also the word desire, which is always very much linked to the human, how you see that from the perspective of the plants. And that's one question. And the other question would be related to, are you including other epistemologies, like from Asia, for instance, how you relate with knowledge through plants, or how plants, for instance, in food, through stimulation, you can also, through eating the plants, you can also kind of embody other stages of desire. So that to me is also a way of sex, let's say. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
No. I haven't done any research on how the plants respond. I mean, I know how the plants respond. I don't know how they feel. I think it's, for me, I think, and you know, for me, this is kind of excuse, but it's also sort of answering you in a very honest way. I think it would take millions of years for co-evolution to really play out. So I think it's too short of a time to really see how plants will respond. So this is my thinking, that usually it's something we start, you know, one species will initiate something, and then the other species will respond, and then there will be a co-evolution going on, right? So, you know, I started to do this 4 years ago, and it's only, you know, as our project. I'm thinking maybe the last part will be more like a movement where I invite people to join, so it becomes more like a practice. But unless we as humans, we start to really change the way we live, change the way we practice with other species, then there's not really a strong co-evolutionary force. So it becomes one-time performance, like you said, right? So in this one-time performance, it's very much, of course, it's very much part of our way of thinking about things. We think about these things through these performative ways, but it's not really on the phenomenological level, right? So I think if anything on the phenomenological level will require millions of years of, maybe if we do it faster, it will be thousands of years of co-evolution. So that's one thing. But I do think where you are suggesting is something very important. I mean, that's you know, it's in my mind, and I've been trying to move myself, but also trying to move in my practice where so it's no longer just thinking, talking, discoursing, using language, but really thinking about how our bodies change, right? So it's not only to think about how the plants will respond, but also how, by doing these practices, I mean, if I see the film as a practice, but I'm also doing other practices. By doing these practices, how our bodies will change gradually, if not genetically. Okay, but of course, this goes into more bioart area, which I'm not really that active, you know, which I haven't been actively engaging yet. And then I think my intention in making the film is not really so much in the bioart sense. Okay, so of course, these projects are still very much about gestures or performative gestures to raise these questions that we need to start dealing with. But I completely acknowledge your question. I have, you know, this is, you know, I keep saying, no matter how many years I can work on this until I die, I'll be only scratching the surface. because whatever we really want to change, it really takes generations of coevolution, etc., to change our bodies and genes. So I don't think my art practice will ever get to that point. Okay, but I do think it's, you know, as artists, we can start to raise these, and that we can talk and debate about this. But I mean, I can also say, I mean, maybe this will sound very pessimistic. I also, I mean, you talk about you talk about desire, right? You talk about pleasure. I think it's very much in our desire still to get closer to other beings, right? Because we are so detached from other forms of life. So this sort of biophilic desire, I think it has to be one of the strongest desires that we have right now. I'm not sure whether other beings, other like plants, they really desire our company, right? So of course you can say, okay, in that sense, the film is also still has the anthropocentric flavor, which I fully acknowledge. Yes, that's why I mean I mentioned, you know, this year I'm talking to scientists to think about how plants actually practice politics in their own terms. Yes.
If I may jump in and connect this answer to a question that has appeared on our live stream. Someone in the public asks the question of trust. So you mentioned about desire, and if the desire from our side, but also if the plants desire us. But the question from our viewer is it somehow a form of trust in the regenerating power of nature?
I'm actually really fascinated. I mean, I'm saying something else just to take a step. So I'm really fascinated by every time I show this work. I mean, I'm showing images, not the actual work itself. Every time I show this work, these ethical questions arise. Right? So, you know, after a little while, I always say, you know, as humans, whenever we think about sex, we think about ethics. And it's almost like it's only when we start to think about sex, we start to think about ethics. Of course, we interact with plants all the time, right? I'm sure everyone, maybe very few people, all of us, I mean, the majority of us eat plants, right? We rarely talk about our ethical relations to plants. I mean, we spend more time thinking about our ethical relations to animals. So precisely by doing this sort of ecosexual performance, I hope to bring these sort of ethical issues to the foreground in our relations to plants. I think many people are doing this at the same time. It's, you know, this question of trust. Is it that we, you know, the trust between us? Or in this particular situation, is it just the trust in the sexual situation, or is it a trust in the sort of the visualizing situation? I think there are also many layers of this trust, right? And also, you know, how do we even think about the activity that we're doing now, right? So we're talking about plants as humans, right? So we're, you know, I always say that I'm also hypocritical because I'm still talking to humans, right? I'm still, you know, I'm still doing a discussion purely with humans on human language, etc. Yeah.
May I maybe jump in quickly and grab the question you actually already offered, which was like on your current research in Berlin, the botanical comrades, how do plants practice politics? Maybe you can elaborate that a little bit. And for me, it also connects to this. You've been talking a lot about weeds, but you never really, how do you say, told us what kind of importance weeds have for you, or for, I guess also for political practice, or for urban context.
Right. Right. So there are two levels. When I first started working with plants, I was working mainly with weeds because I was responding to the urban situation in China, where as we deepen in our modernization, we don't want to see weeds. Right? We want to have clean city. We want to have like sort of a bourgeois landscape, etc. So I was more thinking about the role of weeds in our politics, entangled in our politics. Of course, there are also genetic reasons why weeds are weeds, right? They can respond, they can grow very fast, they can propagate really fast, etc. But now in Berlin, I'm more, like I said, I'm trying to move away from just seeing how plants are entangled in human politics. I want to see how they actually practice politics. So one example I learned from just talking to scientists here. So there's one scientist who studies plasticity, meaning how plants are flexible, right? So they can, if they grow in a cold, like we're talking about genetically same plant, so they can actually respond to different climate situation and then change their bodies. In Berlin, of course, the trees are doing it right now. The leaves fall, and then next spring the leaves grow. But she's talking about how different plants, when they grow in colder climate, in a colder temperature, the flower size changes, right? So, that just triggered something in my mind, that the way plants actually practice things is really by changing their bodies. We tend to think about practice in terms of behavior, in terms of language, etc. For them, practice is really bodily. So if we really want to understand how they practice politics, then we need to think about how, at least, even if we're thinking about the same political issues, then we have to look at, we go voting where we talk about our ideology. But for them to think about, for us to understand their ideology, we have to look at their body form. So these are sort of initial directions. This is only just, I just started this a couple months ago. So these are just the ideas. And then, like I said, they remain as conversations, as ideas, rather than more visual works.
Yeah. And I had another content-wise question. You were talking about this manifesto of, let's call it, ecological equality, which you did which based on this 1922 manifesto. Maybe you can give us an example of what is written in there, like what is one of the ideas or the how to say, topics.
Okay, so one of the ideas, actually, I won't share the slides, but if people are interested, I can, I'll put it online pretty soon. So one of the ideas was actually about art making. So one of the, it's actually a senior artist there, and he said, when we think about equality among species, it's not just about resources and sort of land, etc. It's also about art making. So he in the manifesto, I'm not translating, I'm paraphrasing. So the idea is art making should be an activity perceived but also allowed, not only for humans but also for other species. Right? I think that has really inspired me also to say what I said when I was doing the presentation, how we collaborate with other species when we think about art making. We don't take the full credit because we never really create anything. We're always inspired. But he's also saying there are also, we also talk about specific, there's a sheet where we talk about specific mechanisms of how to encourage art making by other species, etc. Or I think also the first step for me in my mind is always how do we perceive other forms of life, what they're doing, and how, you know, it's also how do we interpret what they're doing.
A lot of your ideas also connect to, how do you call it, famous biologists and authors and philosophers today, and like Donna Haraway or Margolis or Emanuele Coccia, and he has this idea, Emanuele Coccia, about a dialogue between humans and plants, or between with the biosphere by breathing. So maybe that would be like a certain, how would you say, direction, and how we can elaborate the communication with plants in that sense. But my question is more about how much of these kind of ideas that are, one could say, very trendy at the moment, discussed a lot in conferences and exhibitions. How do these ideas relate to your practice?
I met Emanuele Coccia when I was in Paris in 2016. I think that's before he published the book. So we had, you know, he saw my work and we talked about it. And I think it's, of course, I think as artists or as critical thinkers, we are sometimes, I also feel immediately turned off if something becomes very trendy, right? But if I just be more objective, I always say it's better. You know, a friend of mine says in the U.S., half of the humanities scholars are working on environmental humanities, and you know, she said it as a sarcastic comment. I said, well, it's better that this has become trendy than other things become trendy, right? Because I don't, you know, I'm really happy working with plants, and I feel I've learned a lot, but still there's just so much, you know, I keep saying there's so much we just don't know, right? So I actually worry that this becomes too trendy, and then we're, you know, in our world too, you know, things shift so fast that we are not really engaged in the most pressing or the most important issue for a long time. So I actually worry that if it becomes too much a hype, then as humans, we shift our attention to other things too quickly. Because like Juan pointed out, and I think you talk about breathing, you know, there are many, many things we just don't know. And there are many things that takes, you know, as an individual, it takes years of practice, and, you know, as humans, it takes millions of years of evolution to do. And you talk about breathing, and Juan was talking about eating, because Juan also asked about different knowledge paradigm. In Asia, the main paradigm is Chinese medicine, herbal medicine. I haven't worked on this, even though I do use herbal medicine myself, but I haven't really engaged as an artist on this. I don't, you know, because we don't have readily other sort of psychedelic plants around. You know, I'm thinking about going to Yunnan next year. Perhaps there's more there with ethnic groups. But I often joke too, you know, I teach, I often say, instead of teaching for a whole semester, why don't I just give my students a plant to eat, and then they become enlightened over an hour. So there are, these are very legitimate projects. I'm sure there are artists who are, who do these things. Yeah.
Can I add something? Sorry to interrupt. Adrian, are you going to say something? No, okay. Yeah, it's just to add something quickly, and it deals with this epistemic diversity. When we look, as you said, that there are so many things that we don't know, and probably in the Western, we take them as a trend when we kind of discover them, but some of them, they've been there since long time. For instance, the Amazonic perspectivism, where for the Amazonic tribals, everything is human, including the stones. And then everything that is human, which is everything, just became a little bit or more human or less human, let's say, for the shapes that they take or their properties that they have. And that's why the tribals need to do tattoos and to mark their bodies to get this kind of distance visually from everything that surrounds them. And I don't know, and probably you are familiar with the ayahuasca rituals that one of the translations of the meaning of the ayahuasca will be the entangling of souls, because when you in the ayahuascas, when you actually drink the poison of this plant, you can travel through all these humanities and resolve the problems that the community have. So when I was calling about desire, to me, this is the response of a plant in the body of a large community that goes from different kind of humanities. But of course, this is from a different epistemic tradition that we don't have, unfortunately, much access, but it's very, very intriguing anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say one, about the film, I honestly think there's an element that I'm trapped by the ferns, because of course it's me, you can say I have agency, I decided to do the film, but I was really taken when I go to the forest, right? So like I said, it's also the plants in Shanghai, which really changed me quite quickly from working with humans to working with plants. So I really don't think it's just me deciding what to do. Right. So it's also these ferns, they're just so gorgeous. I mean, of course, they're gorgeous, they're mysterious. And, like I said, we also eat the plant. And so there's something that they're doing to me. There's another thing when you said, I mean, I'll say this may not be the most politically correct thing to say. I also say, in addition to learning from indigenous practice, I consider Taoism part of our Chinese indigenous wisdom. In addition to learning from human indigenous wisdom, there is a lot, like the reason I felt so happy to see the wasp and then bees having sex, because they probably started millions of years ago, right? So they started doing this millions of years ago, I'm sure before even indigenous humans, so-called indigenous humans, started to do things. So it's also I think now a lot of us are paying attention to indigenous practice, wisdom, etc. But I'm sure there's once we feel more comfortable in that level, there's another level where we really have to learn from what other beings have started doing long before we are talking, but I'm sure many of us realize we're pretty dumb as beings on this planet. Yeah.
There's a question from Monica, who's actually here with us, but she wrote it, also a way of indirect communication. And she asks, and I think this connects to the dumbness of human beings, does the cognitive nature of plants play any role in your work?
The computer is low in power. No, like I said, I'm talking to scientists this year, trying to learn from their research. I have, you mentioned there are these philosophers. I think I've read probably more theories than science. That's why I'm trying to read more science this year. I don't think the scientists I've talked to this year have been telling me about cognition. There's one person working on how plants negotiate with bacteria. There is someone working on mycorrhizal fungi. I'm making a new short film, which will be shown next year. Part of it, we talk about cognition. Now I just realized, when I was talking to Matthias Rillig, an ecologist, he was using cognition as our ability to focus and filter out noise, so we can recognize things. For example, I'm looking at a screen, I can see Adrian's face, so that's because I can filter out all the noise around me. And plants don't do it. Plants actually sense things. So that may not be, I haven't read people like the Italian guy, I forgot, Stefano, I forgot, there are people who are writing on this. I don't think that would be considered cognition. So plants actually sense things. And one thing very different is they actually taking all the signals. They synthesize all the signals in order to make a holistic decision. So there's one part I was talking to Stefano Mancuso. So precisely the discussion we had was about our cognitive abilities. I just realized our cognitive abilities may be a limitation that we have. By focusing, we actually lose the holistic signals. But I don't know if ecologists will call this cognition or not.
I also jump in with a question from the Facebook page, actually. So coming back to the notion of desire, do you think desire as a natural basic feeling has become something that society looks down at and overlooks, just as nature desire is being overlooked and not appreciated and respected, perhaps? How do you view the digitalization that is taking place in the midst of COVID, and in terms of all of us coming closer or further away from nature and its true essence? Many people say that they long more for nature now than ever, but at the same time, they aren't able to experience it.
I mentioned earlier in a conversation already that our desire for nature is probably the strongest we have, because precisely like this person is raising the question, because the technologies and then the social system we have built up really suppress this desire. I'm sure there are better theorists who write on this. I just wrote something recently for myself, that the less time I spent with humans, including this discussion, the more time I actually have to spend with other beings. It's never really, none of us have infinite time. So it's really about how much time we spend on doing something versus doing something else, right? So I actually really want to, watch out the time I spend interacting with other humans in order to spend more time with other beings like plants and birds. And I was in this earlier discussion with a group of Chinese artists, and I said, now in sort of post-industrial societies in particular, it's people who have more privilege, have more access to nature, have more time in nature, right? So it's actually people who have less privilege in society are spending so much time with technology. So this is something I'm sure a lot of people are writing about this. Yeah.
So that was a very nice hint for my role as a course leader. We are already 10 minutes over time, and we don't want to steal more time from you spending time with other beings than humans. But maybe is there one last question or something? Or yes, Christina.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. because I was fascinated, Zheng, by how you, during your presentation, at one moment, there seemed to be a kind of shift, or kind of this idea of not trying to control everything anymore in your practice. And I was wondering if, since that moment that you talked about, and letting things more happen, or even plans guiding you, if something changed how you approach things, or just this idea of not being in control all the time. I find it very fascinating.
I will sound like a preacher now if I say this, but you know, like I'm still in the process, and I really recommend. I mean, I'll break the book. So I mean, I think there are two things that really help me. One is just to go walk in the forest, and also spend, like I said, spend as much time with as possible with plants. And then the other thing is, like, you know, this book I've been reading this year. It's a translation of Dao De Jing. It's a good translation because it's a rigorous translation. You know, if you read this, you know, this text was written 2,500 years ago, and it's very short. It's 5,000 Chinese words. So if you read this text, you will definitely have a strong. You will have the strength to let things grow, rather than try to control things. Yeah.
I think that is